British allies. Death of Squire Boone. Indian outrages. Gerty and McGee. Battle of Blue Lick. Death of Isaac Boone. Colonel Boone's narrow escape. Letter of Daniel Boone. Determination of General Clarke. Discouragement of the savages. Amusing anecdote of Daniel Boone. It was in the autumn of the year 1780 that Daniel Boone, with his family, returned to Boonesborough. A year before, the Legislature of Virginia had recognized essentially what is now Kentucky as one of the counties of Virginia, and had established the town of Boonesborough as its capital. By this act, Daniel Boone was named one of the trustees or selectmen. Town lots were ordered to be surveyed, and a very liberal grant of land was conferred upon everyone who would erect a house at least 16 feet square with either brick, stone, or dirt chimney. For some reason, Colonel Boone declined this office. It is probable that he was disgusted by his own experience in the civil courts. There was little danger now of an attack upon Boonesborough by the Indians. There were so many settlements around it that no foe could approach without due warning and without encountering serious opposition. On the 6th of October, Daniel Boone, with his brother Squire, left the fort alone for what would seem to be an exceedingly imprudent excursion, so defenseless, to the Blue Licks. They reached the Licks in safety. While there, they were discovered by a party of Indians and were fired upon from ambush. Squire Boone was instantly killed and scalped. Daniel, heart-stricken by the loss of his beloved brother, fled like a deer, pursued by the whole band, filling the forest with their yells like a pack of hounds. The Indians had a very powerful dog with them, who, with unerring scent, followed closely in the trail of the fugitive. For 3 miles, this unequal chase continued. The dog, occasionally embarrassed in his pursuit, would be delayed for a time in regaining the trail. The speed of Boone was such that the foremost of the savages was left far behind. He then, as the dog came bounding on, stopped, took deliberate aim, and shot the brute. Boone was still far from the fort, but he reached it in safety, leaving upon the Indians the impression that he bore a charmed life. He was very deeply afflicted by the death of his brother. Squire was the youngest of the sons, and the tie which bound the brothers together was unusually tender and confidential. They had shared in many perilous adventures, and for months had dwelt entirely alone in the wilderness, far away from any other society. The winter of 1780 was one of the saddest in the annals of our country. The colonial army, everywhere defeated, was in the most deplorable state of destitution and suffering. Our frontiers were most cruelly ravaged by a barbarian foe. To add to all this, the winter was severely cold, beyond any precedent. The crops had been so destroyed by the enemy that many of the pioneers were compelled to live almost entirely upon the flesh of the buffalo. Virginia, in extending her jurisdiction over her western lands of Kentucky, now, for the sake of a more perfect military organization, divided the extensive region into 3 counties: Fayette, Lincoln, and Jefferson. General Clarke was made commander-in-chief of the Kentucky militia. Daniel Boone was commissioned as lieutenant colonel of Lincoln County. The emigration into the state at this time may be inferred from the fact that the Court of Commissioners to examine land titles, at the close of its session of 7 months, had granted 3,000 claims. Its meetings had been held mainly at Boonesborough, and its labors terminated in April 1780. During the spring, 300 barges loaded with emigrants were floated down the Ohio to the falls, at what is now Louisville. As we have stated, the winter had been one of the most remarkable on record. From the middle of November to the middle of February, the ground was covered with snow and ice without a thaw. The severity of the cold was terrible. Nearly all unprotected animals perished. Even bears, buffalo, wolves, and wild turkeys were found frozen in the woods. The starving wild animals often came near the settlement for food. For 75 years, the winter of 1780 was an era to which the old men referred. Though the Indians organized no formidable raids, they were very annoying. No one could safely wander any distance from the forts. In March 1781, several bands entered Jefferson County and, by lying in ambush, killed 4 of the settlers. Captain Whitaker with 15 men went in pursuit of them. He followed their trail to the banks of the Ohio. Supposing they had crossed, he and his party embarked in canoes, boldly to continue the pursuit into the Indian country. They had scarcely pushed a rod from the shore when hideous yells rose from the Indians in ambush, and a deadly fire was opened upon the canoes. 9 of the pioneers were instantly killed or wounded. The savages, having accomplished this feat, fled into the wilderness, where the party, thus weakened in numbers, could not pursue them. A small party of settlers had reared their log huts near the present site of Shelbyville. Squire Boone had been one of the prominent actors in the establishment of this little colony. Alarmed by the menaces of the savages, these few settlers decided to remove to a more secure station on Bears Creek. On their way, they were startled by the war whoop of they knew not how many Indians concealed in ambush, and a storm of bullets fell upon them, killing and wounding many of their number. The miscreants, scarcely waiting for the return fire, fled with yells which resounded through the forest, leaving their victims to the sad task of burying the dead and nursing the wounded. Colonel Floyd collected 25 men to pursue them. The wary Indians, nearly 200 in number, drew them into an ambush and opened upon the party a deadly fire which almost instantly killed half their number. The remainder with great difficulty escaped, leaving their dead to be mutilated by the scalping knife of the savage. Almost every day brought tidings of similar disasters. The Indians, emboldened by these successes, seemed to rouse themselves to a new determination to exterminate the whites. The conduct of the British government, in calling such wretches to their alliance in their war with the colonies, created the greatest exasperation. Thomas Jefferson gave expression to the public sentiment in the Declaration of Independence, in which he says, in arraignment of King George III, he has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. There were two wretched men, official agents of the British government, who were more savage than the savages themselves. One of them, a vagabond named Simon Gerty, had joined the Indians by adoption. He had not only acquired their habits, but had become their leader in the most awful scenes of ferocity. He was a Tory, and as such was the bitterest foe of the colonists who were struggling for independence. The other, Colonel McGee, with a little more respectability of character, was equally fiend-like in exciting the Indians to the most revolting barbarities. Thus incited and sustained by British authority, the Indians kept all the settlers in Kentucky in constant alarm. Instigated by the authorities at Detroit, the warriors of 5 tribes assembled at Old Chillicothe to organize the most formidable expedition which had as yet invaded Kentucky. These tribes were the Shawnees on the Little Miami, the Cherokees on the Tennessee, the Wyandots on the Sandusky, the Tawas on the Maumee, and the Delawares on the Muskingum. Their choicest warriors, 500 in number, rendezvoused at Old Chillicothe. This Indian village was built in the form of a square enclosing a large area. Some of their houses were of logs, some of bark, some of reeds filled in with clay. Boone says that the Indians concentrated their utmost force and vengeance upon this expedition, hoping to destroy the settlements and to depopulate the country at a single blow. Not far from Boonesborough, in the same valley of the Kentucky, there was a small settlement called Bryant's Station. William Bryant, the founder, had married a sister of Colonel Boone. On the 15th of August, a war party of 500 Indians and Canadians, under the leadership of Simon Gerty, appeared before this little cluster of log huts, each of which was of course bulletproof. The settlers fought heroically. Gerty was wounded and 30 of his band were killed, while the garrison lost but 4. The assailing party, thus disappointed in their expectation of carrying the place by storm, and fearing the arrival of reinforcements from other settlements, hastily retired. Colonel Boone, hearing of the attack, hastened to the rescue, joining troops from several of the adjacent forts. The party consisted of 180 men, under the leadership of Colonel Todd, one of nature's noblemen. Colonel Boone seems to have been second in command. 2 of his sons, Israel and Samuel, accompanied their father upon this expedition. The Indians, led by British officers, were far more to be dreaded than when left to their own cunning, which was often childish. As the little band of pioneers, rushing to the rescue, approached Bryant's Station and were informed of the retreat of the invaders, a council of war was held to decide whether it were best for 180 men to pursue 500 Indians and Canadians through a region where every mile presented the most favorable opportunities for concealment in ambush. Gerty was a desperado who was to be feared as well as hated. Contrary to the judgment of both Colonels Todd and Boone, it was decided to pursue the Indians. There was no difficulty in following the trail of so large a band, many of whom were mounted. Their path led almost directly north to the Licking River and then followed down its banks towards the Ohio. As the pursuers were cautiously advancing, they came to a remarkable bend in the stream where there was a large and open space with prairie grass very high. A well-trampled buffalo track led through this grass, which was almost like a forest of reeds. Along this street, the Indians had retreated. The scouts who had been sent forward to explore returned with the report that there were no signs of Indians. And yet 400 savages had so adroitly concealed themselves that their line really extended from bank to bank of the river, where it bent like a horseshoe before them. The combined cunning of the Indian and the intelligence of their white leaders was now fatally enlisted for the destruction of the settlers. 180 men were to be caught in a trap, with 500 demons prepared to shoot them down. As soon as Colonel Todd's party passed the neck of this bend, the Indians closed in behind them, rose from their concealment, and with terrific yells opened upon them a still more terrific fire. The pioneers fought with the courage of desperation. At the first discharge, nearly 1/3 of Colonel Todd's little party fell dead or wounded. Struck fatally by several bullets, Colonel Todd himself fell from his horse drenched with blood. While a portion of the Indians kept up the fire, others, with hideous yells, sprang forward with tomahawk and scalping knife, completing their fiend-like work. It was a scene of awful confusion and dismay. The survivors, fighting every step of the way, retreated towards the river, for there was no escape back through their thronging foes. Colonel Boone's two sons fought by the side of their father. Samuel the younger, struck by a bullet, was severely but not mortally wounded. Israel, his second son, fell dead. The unhappy father took his dead boy upon his shoulders to save him from the scalping knife. As he tottered beneath the bleeding body, an Indian of Herculean stature with uplifted tomahawk rushed upon him. Colonel Boone dropped the body of his son, shot the Indian through the heart, and seeing the savages rushing upon him from all directions, fled, leaving the corpse of his boy to its fate. Being intimately acquainted with the ground, he plunged into a ravine, baffling several parties who pursued him, swam across the river, and entering the forest succeeded in escaping from his foes, and at length safely by a circuitous route returned to Bryant's station. In the meantime, the scene of tumult and slaughter was awful beyond all description. Victors and vanquished were blended together upon the banks of the stream. In this dreadful conflict there were 4 Indians to each white man. There was a narrow ford at the spot, but the whole stream seemed clogged, some swimming and some trying to wade, while the exultant Indians shot and tomahawked without mercy. Those who succeeded in crossing the river, leaving the great buffalo track which they had been following, plunged into the thickets, and though vigorously pursued by the Indians, most of them eventually reached the settlements. In this dreadful disaster, the colonists lost 60 men in killed and 7 were taken prisoners. The Indians, in counting up their loss, found that 64 were missing. In accordance with their barbaric custom, they selected in vengeance 4 of the prisoners and put them to death by the most terrible tortures which savage ingenuity could devise. Had Colonel Boone's advice been followed, this calamity might have been avoided. Still, characteristically, he uttered not a word of complaint. In his comments upon the event he says, "I cannot reflect upon this dreadful scene, but sorrow fills my heart." A zeal for the defense of their country led these heroes to the scene of action, though with a few men to attack a powerful army of experienced warriors. When we gave way, they pursued us with the utmost eagerness and in every quarter spread destruction. The river was difficult to cross, and many were killed in the flight, some just entering the river, some in the water, others after crossing, in ascending the cliffs. Some escaped on horseback, a few on foot, and being dispersed everywhere in a few hours, brought the melancholy news of this unfortunate conflict to Lexington. The reader may guess what sorrow filled the hearts of the inhabitants, exceeding anything I am able to describe. Being reinforced, we returned to bury the dead, and found their bodies strewed everywhere, cut and mangled in a dreadful manner. This mournful scene exhibited a horror almost unparalleled. Some torn and eaten by wild beasts, those in the river eaten by fishes, all in such a putrefied condition that no one could be distinguished from another. This Battle of the Blue Licks, as it is called, occupies one of the most mournful pages in the history of Kentucky. The escape of Boone adds another to the extraordinary adventures of this chivalric and now sorrow-stricken man. Colonel Boone communicated an official report to the governor of Virginia, Benjamin Harrison, father of William Henry Harrison, subsequently President of the United States. In this report, it is noticeable that Boone makes no allusion whatever to his own services. This modest document throws such light upon the character of this remarkable man and upon the peril of the times that it merits full insertion here. It is as follows. Boone's Station, Fayette Co. Aug. 30, 1782. Sir, present circumstances of affairs cause me to write to your Excellency as follows. On the 16th instant, a large body of Indians with some white men attacked one of our frontier stations known as Bryant's Station. The siege continued from about sunrise until 2 o'clock of the next day, when they marched off. Notice being given to the neighboring stations, we immediately raised 181 horsemen, commanded by Call John Todd, including some of the Lincoln County militia, and pursued about 40 miles. After a brief account of the battle which we have already given, he continues, "Afterwards we were reinforced by Colonel Logan, which made our force 460 men. We marched again to the battle ground, but finding the enemy had gone, we proceeded to bury the dead. We found 43 on the ground, and many lay about which we could not stay to find, hungry and weary as we were, and dubious that the enemy might not have gone off quite. By the sign we thought that the Indians exceeded 400, while the whole of the militia of the county does not amount to more than 130. From these facts your Excellency may form an idea of our situation. I know that your own circumstances are critical, but are we to be wholly forgotten? I hope not. I trust that about 500 men may be sent to our assistance immediately. If these shall be stationed as our county lieutenant shall deem necessary, it may be the means of saving our part of the country. but if they are placed under the direction of General Clarke, they will be of little or no service to our settlement. The falls lie 100 miles west of us and the Indians northeast, while our men are frequently called to protect them. I have encouraged the people in this county all that I could, but I can no longer justify them or myself to risk our lives here under such extraordinary hazards. The inhabitants of this county are very much alarmed at the thoughts of the Indians bringing another campaign into our country this fall. If this should be the case, it will break up these settlements. I hope, therefore, that your Excellency will take the matter into your consideration and send us some relief as quick as possible. These are my sentiments without consulting any person. Colonel Logan will, I expect, immediately send you an express, by whom I humbly request your Excellency's answer. In the meantime, I remain yours, etc., Daniel Boone. General Clarke, who was the military leader of Kentucky under the colonial government, was established at the Falls. The British authorities held their headquarters at Detroit, from which post they were sending out their Indian allies in all directions to ravage the frontiers. General Clarke was a man of great energy of character, and he was anxious to organize an expedition against Detroit. With this object in view, he had by immense exertions assembled a force of nearly 2,000 men. Much to his chagrin, he received orders to remain at the Falls for the present, to protect the frontiers then so severely menaced. But when the tidings reached him of the terrible disaster at the Blue Lick, he resolved to pursue the Indians and punish them with the greatest severity. The exultant savages had returned to Old Chillicothe and had divided their spoil and their captives. Colonel Boone was immediately sent for to take part in this expedition. Clarke's army crossed the Ohio and, marching very rapidly up the banks of the Little Miami, arrived within 2 miles of Chillicothe before they were discovered. On perceiving the enemy, the Indians scattered in all directions. Men, women, and children fled into the remote forest, abandoning their homes and leaving everything behind them. The avenging army swept the valley with fire and ruin. Their corn, just ripening, and upon which they mainly relied for their winter supply of food, was utterly destroyed. Every tree which bore any fruit was felled, and 5 of their towns were laid in ashes. The trail of the army presented a scene of utter desolation. The savages were alike astonished and dismayed. They had supposed that the white men, disheartened by their dreadful defeat at the Blue Lick, would abandon the country. Instead of that, with amazing recuperative power, they had scarcely reached their homes ere another army, utterly resistless in numbers, is burning their towns and destroying their whole country. This avenging campaign so depressed the Indians that they made no farther attempt for the organized invasion of Kentucky. The termination of the war with England also deprived them of their military resources, and left them to their own unaided and unintelligent efforts. Still, miserable bands continued prowling around, waging and murdering the lonely traveler, setting fire to the solitary hut, and inflicting such other outrages as were congenial with their cruel natures. It thus became necessary for the pioneers always to live with the rifle in hand. Colonel Boone had become especially obnoxious to the Indians. Twice he had escaped from them, under circumstances which greatly mortified their vanity. They recognized the potency of his rifle in the slaughter of their own warriors at the Blue Lick, and they were well aware that it was his sagacity which led the army of General Clarke in its avenging march through their country. It thus became with them an object of intense desire to take him prisoner, and had he been taken, he would doubtless have been doomed to the severest torture they could inflict. Mr. Peck, in his interesting Life of Boone, gives the following account of one of the extraordinary adventures of this man, which he received from the lips of Colonel Boone himself. On one occasion, 4 Indians suddenly appeared before his cabin and took him prisoner. Though the delicacy of Colonel Boone's organization was such that he could never himself relish tobacco in any form, he still raised some for his friends and neighbors, and for what were then deemed the essential rites of hospitality. As a shelter for curing the tobacco, he had built an enclosure of rails a dozen feet in height and covered with canes and grass. Stalks of tobacco are generally split and strung on sticks about 4 feet in length. The ends of these are laid on poles placed across the tobacco house and in tiers one above another to the roof. Boone had fixed his temporary shelter in such a manner as to have 3 tiers. He had covered the lower tier and the tobacco had become dry. When he entered the shelter for the purpose of removing the sticks to the upper tier, preparatory to gathering the remainder of the crop, he had hoisted up the sticks from the lower to the second tier and was standing on the poles which supported it while raising the sticks to the upper tier when 4 stout Indians with guns entered the low door and called him by name. Illustration: "Now, Boone, we got you, you no get away more. We carry you off to Chillicothe this time. You no cheat us any more." Boone looked down upon their upturned faces, saw their loaded guns pointed at his breast, and recognizing some of his old friends the Shawanese who had made him prisoner near the Blue Licks in 1778, coolly and pleasantly responded, "Ah, old friends, glad to see you." Perceiving that they manifested impatience to have him come down, he told them he was quite willing to go with them and only begged that they would wait where they were and watch him closely until he could finish removing the tobacco. While thus parleying with them, Boone inquired earnestly respecting his old friends in Chillicothe. He continued for some time to divert the attention of these simple-minded men by allusions to past events with which they were familiar and by talking of his tobacco, his mode of curing it, and promising them an abundant supply. With their guns in their hands, however, they stood at the door of the shed, grouped closely together so as to render his escape apparently impossible. In the meantime, Boone carefully gathered his arms full of the long, dry tobacco leaves, filled with pungent dust, which would be blinding and stifling as the most powerful snuff, and then with a leap from his station 12 feet high came directly upon their heads, filling their eyes and nostrils and so bewildering and disabling them for the moment that they lost all self-possession and all self-control. Boone, agile as a deer, darted out at the door and in a moment was in his bulletproof log hut, which to him was an impregnable citadel. Loopholes guarded every approach. The Indians could not show themselves without exposure to certain death. They were too well acquainted with the unerring aim of Boone's rifle to venture within its range. Keeping the log cabin between them and their redoubtable foe, the baffled Indians fled into the wilderness. Colonel Boone related this adventure with great glee, imitating the gestures of the bewildered Indians. He said that notwithstanding his narrow escape, he could not resist the temptation, as he reached the door of his cabin, to look around to witness the effect of his achievement. The Indians, coughing, sneezing, blinded, and almost suffocated by the tobacco dust, were throwing out their arms and groping about in all directions, cursing him for a rogue and calling themselves fools. Kentucky organized as a state. Peace with England. Order of a Kentucky Court. Anecdote speech of Mr. Dalton. Reply of Pine-Casho. Renewed indications of Indian hostility. Conventions at Danville, Kentucky formed into a state. New trials for Boone. The close of the War of the Revolution, bringing peace between the colonies and the mother country, deprived the Indians of that powerful alliance which had made them truly formidable. Being no longer able to obtain a supply of ammunition from the British arsenals, or to be guided in their murderous raids by British intelligence, they also, through their chiefs, entered into treaties of peace with the rapidly increasing emigrants. Though these treaties with the Indians prevented any general organization of the tribes, vagabond Indians, entirely lawless, were wandering in all directions, ever ready to perpetrate any outrage. Civil society has its highway robbers, burglars, and murderers. Much more so was this the case among these savages, exasperated by many wrongs, for it cannot be denied that they were more frequently sinned against than sinning. Their untutored natures made but little distinction between the innocent and the guilty. If a vagabond white man wantonly shot an Indian, and many were as ready to do it as to shoot a wolf, the friends of the murdered Indian would take revenge upon the inmates of the first white man's cabin they encountered in the wilderness. Thus it was necessary for the pioneers to be constantly upon their guard. If they wandered any distance from the fort while hunting, or were hoeing in the field, or ventured to rear a cabin on a fertile meadow at a distance from the stations, they were liable to be startled at any hour of the day or of the night by the terrible war whoop, and to feel the weight of savage vengeance. This exposure to constant peril influenced the settlers, as a general rule, to establish themselves in stations. This gave them companionship, the benefits of cooperative labor, and security against any small prowling bands. These stations were formed upon the model of the one which Daniel Boone had so wisely organized at Boonesborough. They consisted of a cluster of bulletproof log cabins, arranged in a quadrangular form so as to enclose a large internal area. All the doors opened upon this interior space. Here the cattle were gathered at night. The intervals between the cottages were filled with palisades, also bulletproof. Loopholes through the logs enabled these riflemen to guard every approach to their fortress. Thus they had little to fear from the Indians when sheltered by these strong citadels. Emigration to Kentucky began very rapidly to increase. Large numbers crossed the mountains to Pittsburgh, where they took flat boats and floated down the beautiful Ohio, La Belle Riviere, until they reached such points on its southern banks as pleased them for a settlement, or from which they could ascend the majestic rivers of that peerless state. Comfortable homesteads were fast rising in all directions. Horses, cattle, swine, and poultry of all kinds were multiplied. Farming utensils began to make their appearance. The hum of happy industry was heard where wolves had formerly howled and buffalo ranged. Merchandise in considerable quantities was transported over the mountains on pack horses, and then floated down the Ohio and distributed among the settlements upon its banks. Country stores arose, land speculators appeared, and continental paper money became a circulating medium. This money, however, was not of any very great value, as may be inferred from the following decree, passed by one of the county courts, establishing the schedule of prices for tavern keeping. The court doth set the following rates to be observed by keepers in this county: whiskey $15 the half pint, rum $10 the gallon, a meal $12, stabling or pasturage $4 the night. Under these changed circumstances, Colonel Boone, whose intrepidity nothing could daunt, and whose confidence in the protective power of his rifle was unbounded, had reared for himself, on one of the beautiful meadows of the Kentucky, a commodious home. He had selected a spot whose fertility and loveliness pleased his artistic eye. It is estimated that during the years 1783 and 1784, nearly 12,000 persons emigrated to Kentucky. Still, all these had to move with great caution, with rifles always loaded and ever on the alert against surprise. The following incident will give the reader an idea of the perils and wild adventures encountered by these parties in their search for new and distant homes. Colonel Thomas Marshall, a man of much note in those days, had crossed the Alleghanies with his large family. At Pittsburgh he purchased a flatboat and was floating down the Ohio. He had passed the mouth of the Kanawha River without any incident of note occurring. About 10 o'clock one night, as his boat had drifted near the northern shore of the solitary stream, he was hailed by a man upon the bank, who, after inquiring who he was, where he was bound, etc., added, "I have been posted here by order of my brother, Simon Gerty, to warn all boats of the danger of permitting themselves to be decoyed ashore. My brother regrets very deeply the injury he has inflicted upon the white men, and to convince them of the sincerity of his repentance, and of his earnest desire to be restored to their society, he has stationed me here to warn all boats of the snares which are spread for them by the cunning of the Indians. Renegade white men will be placed upon the banks, who will represent themselves as in the greatest distress. Even children taken captive will be compelled by threats of torture to declare that they are all alone upon the shore and to entreat the boats to come and rescue them. But keep in the middle of the river," said Gerty, "and steel your heart against any supplications you may hear." The colonel thanked him for his warning and continued to float down the rapid current of the stream. Virginia had passed a law establishing the town of Louisville at the falls of the Ohio. A very thriving settlement soon sprang up there. The nature of the warfare still continuing between the whites and the Indians may be inferred from the following narrative, which we give in the words of Colonel Boone. The Indians continued to practice mischief secretly upon the inhabitants in the exposed part of the country. In October, a party made an incursion into a district called Crab Orchard. One of these Indians, having advanced some distance before the others, boldly entered the house of a poor defenseless family, in which was only a Negro man, a woman and her children, terrified with apprehensions of immediate death. The savage, perceiving their defenseless condition without offering violence to the family, attempted to capture the Negro, who happily proved an overmatch for him and threw the Indian on the ground. In the struggle, the mother of the children drew an axe from the corner of the cottage and cut off the head of the Indian, while her little daughter shut the door. The savages soon appeared and applied their tomahawks to the door. An old rusty gun barrel without a lock lay in the corner, which the mother put through a small crevice, and the savages, perceiving it, fled. In the meantime, the alarm spread through the neighborhood. The armed men collected immediately and pursued the savages into the wilderness. Thus Providence, by means of this Negro, saved the whole of the poor family from destruction. The heroism of Mrs. Merrill is worthy of being perpetuated, not only as a wonderful achievement, but as illustrative of the nature of this dreadful warfare. Mr. Merrill, with his wife, little son, and daughter, occupied a remote cabin in Nelson County, Kentucky. On the 24th of December, 1791, he was alarmed by the barking of his dog. Opening the door to ascertain the cause, he was instantly fired upon by 7 or 8 Indians who had crept near the house, secreting themselves behind stumps and trees. 2 bullets struck him, fracturing the bones both of his leg and of his arm. The savages, with hideous yells, then rushed for the door. Mrs. Merrill had but just time to close and bolt it when the savages plunged against it and hewed it with their tomahawks. Every dwelling was at that time a fortress whose log walls were bullet-proof. But for the terrible wounds which Mr. Merrill had received, he would, with his rifle shooting through loopholes, soon have put the savages to flight. They, emboldened by the supposition that he was killed, cut away at the door till they had opened a hole sufficiently large to crawl through. One of the savages attempted to enter. He had got nearly in when Mrs. Merrill cleft his skull with an axe, and he fell lifeless upon the floor. Another, supposing that he had safely effected an entrance, followed him and encountered the same fate. 4 more of the savages were in this way dispatched, when the others, suspecting that all was not right, climbed upon the roof and 2 of them endeavored to descend through the chimney. The noise they made directed the attention of the inmates of the cabin to the new danger. There was a gentle fire burning upon the hearth. Mr. Merrill, with much presence of mind, directed his son, while his wife guarded the opening of the door with her axe, to empty the contents of a feather bed upon the fire. The dense, smothering smoke filled the flue of the chimney. The 2 savages, suffocated with the fumes, after a few convulsive efforts to ascend, fell almost insensible down upon the hearth. Mr. Merrill, seizing with his unbroken arm a billet of wood, dispatched them both. But one of the Indians now remained. Peering in at the opening in the door, he received a blow from the axe of Mrs. Merrill which severely wounded him. Bleeding and disheartened, he fled alone into the wilderness, the only one of the 8 who survived the conflict. A white man who was at that time a prisoner among the Indians and who subsequently effected his escape, reported that when the wounded savage reached his tribe, he said to the white captive in broken English, "I have bad news for the poor Indian. Me lose a son, me lose a broder." The squaws have taken the breech clout and fight worse than the long knives. But the Indians were not always the aggressors. Indeed, it is doubtful whether they would ever have raised the war whoop against the white man had it not been for the outrages they were so constantly experiencing from unprincipled and vagabond adventurers who were ever infesting the frontiers. The following incident illustrates the character and conduct of these miscreants. A party of Indian hunters from the south, wandering through their ancient hunting grounds of Kentucky, accidentally came upon a settlement where they found several horses grazing in the field. They stole the horses and commenced a rapid retreat to their own country. 3 young men, Davis, Caffer, and McClure, pursued them. Not being able to overtake the fugitives, they decided to make reprisals on the first Indians they should encounter. It so happened that they soon met 3 Indian hunters. The parties saluted each other in a friendly manner and proceeded on their way in pleasant companionship. The young men said that they observed the Indians conversing with one another in low tones of voice, and thus they became convinced that the savages meditated treachery. Resolving to anticipate the Indians' attack, they formed the following plan. While walking together in friendly conversation, the Indians being entirely off their guard, Caffer, who was a very powerful man, was to spring upon the lightest of the Indians, crush him to the ground, and thus take him a prisoner. At the same instant, Davis and McClure were each to shoot one of the other Indians, who, being thus taken by surprise, could offer no resistance. The signal was given. Caffer sprang upon his victim and bore him to the ground. McClure shot his man dead. Davis' gun flashed in the pan. The Indian, thus narrowly escaping death, immediately aimed his gun at Caffer, who was struggling with the one he had grappled, and instantly killed him. McClure in his turn shot the Indian. There was now 1 Indian and 2 white men, but the Indian had the loaded rifle. McClure's was discharged and Davis missed fire. The Indian, springing from the grasp of his dying antagonist, presented his rifle at Davis, who immediately fled, hotly pursued by the Indian. McClure, stopping only to reload his gun, followed after them. Soon he lost sight of both. Davis was never heard of afterwards. Doubtless he was shot by the avenging Indian, who returned to his wigwam with the white man's scalp. McClure, after this bloody fray, being left alone in the wilderness, commenced a return to his distant home. He had not proceeded far before he met an Indian on horseback accompanied by a boy on foot. The warrior dismounted, and in token of peace offered McClure his pipe. As they were seated together upon a log, conversing, McClure said that the Indian informed him by signs that there were other Indians in the distance who would soon come up, and that then they should take him captive, tie his feet beneath the horse's belly, and carry him off to their village. McClure seized his gun, shot the Indian through the heart, and plunging into the forest, effected his escape. About this same time, Captain James Ward, with a party of half a dozen white men, one of whom was his nephew, and a number of horses, was floating down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh. They were in a flat boat about 45 feet long and 8 feet wide. The gunwale of the boat consisted of but a single pine plank. It was beautiful weather, and for several days they were swept along by the tranquil stream, now borne by the changing current towards the one shore and now towards the other. One morning, when they had been swept by the stream within about 150 feet of the northern shore, suddenly several hundred Indians appeared upon the bank, and uttering savage yells opened upon them a terrible fire. Captain Ward's nephew, pierced by a ball in the breast, fell dead in the bottom of the boat. Every horse was struck by a bullet. Some were instantly killed. Others, severely wounded, struggled so violently as to cause the frail bark to dip water, threatening immediate destruction. All the crew except Captain Ward were so panic-stricken by this sudden assault that they threw themselves flat upon their faces in the bottom of the boat and attempted no resistance, where even the exposure of a hand would be the target for 100 rifles. Fortunately, Captain Ward was protected from this shower of bullets by a post, which for some purpose had been fastened to the gunwale. He therefore retained his position at the helm, which was an oar, striving to guide the boat to the other side of the river. As the assailants had no canoes, they could not attempt to board, but for more than an hour they ran along the banks yelling and keeping up an almost constant fire. At length the boat was swept to the other side of the stream, when the miscreants abandoned the pursuit and disappeared. Quite a large party of emigrants were attacked by the Indians near what is now called Skaggs Creek, and 6 were instantly killed. A Mrs. McClure, delirious with terror, fled she knew not where, followed by her 3 little children and carrying a little babe in her arms. The cries of the babe guided the pursuit of the Indians. They cruelly tomahawked the 3 oldest children and took the mother and the babe as captives. Fortunately, the tidings of this outrage speedily reached one of the settlements. Captain Whitley immediately started in pursuit of the gang. He overtook them, killed 2, wounded 2, and rescued the captives. Such were the scenes enacted during a period of nominal peace with the Indians. There has been transmitted to us a very curious document giving an account of a speech made by Mr. Dalton, a government agent, to a council of Indian chiefs upon the announcement of peace with Great Britain and their reply. Mr. Dalton said, "My children, what I have often told you is now come to pass. This day I received news from my great chief at the Falls of the Ohio. Peace is made with the enemies of America. The white flesh, the Americans, French, and Spanish, this day smoked out of the peace pipe. The tomahawk is buried, and they are now friends. I am told the Shawnees, the Delawares, Chickasaws, Cherokees, and all other red flesh have taken the long knife by the hand. They have given up to them the prisoners that were in their hands. My children on the Wabash, open your ears and let what I tell you sink into your hearts. You know me. Near 20 years I have been among you. The long knife is my nation. I know their hearts. Peace they carry in one hand and war in the other. I leave you to yourselves to judge. Consider and now accept the one or the other. We never beg peace of our enemies. If you love your women and children, receive the belt of wampum I present you. Return me my flesh you have in your villages and the horses you stole from my people in Kentucky. Your cornfields were never disturbed by the long knife. Your women and children lived quiet in their houses while your warriors were killing and robbing my people. All this you know is the truth. This is the last time I shall speak to you. I have waited 6 moons to hear you speak and to get my people from you. In 10 nights I shall leave the Wabash to see my great chief at the Falls of the Ohio, where he will be glad to hear from your own lips what you have to say. Here is tobacco I give you. Smoke and consider what I have said." Mr. Dalton then presented Pyankashaw, the chief of the leading tribe assembled in council, with a belt of blue and white wampum. Pyankashaw received the emblem of peace with much dignity and replied, "And why, great father, the long knife, you have been many years among us. You have suffered by us. We still hope you will have pity and compassion upon us, on our women and children. The sun shines on us, and the good news of peace appears in our faces. This is the day of joy to the Wabash Indians. With one tongue we now speak. We accept your peace belt. We received the tomahawk from the English. Poverty forced us to it. We were followed by other tribes. We are sorry for it. Today we collect the scattered bones of our friends and bury them in one grave. We thus plant the tree of peace that God may spread its branches so that we can all be secured from bad weather. Here is the pipe that gives us joy. Smoke out of it. Our warriors are glad you are the man we present it to. We have buried the tomahawk, have formed friendship never to be broken, and now we smoke out of your pipe. My father, we know that the Great Spirit was angry with us for stealing your horses and attacking your people. He has sent us so much snow and cold weather as to kill your horses with our own. We are a poor people. We hope God will help us and that the long knife will have compassion on our women and children. Your people who are with us are well. We shall collect them when they come in from hunting. All the prisoners taken in Kentucky are alive. We love them, and so do our young women. Some of your people mend our guns, and others tell us they can make rum out of corn. They are now the same as we. In 1 moon after this, we will take them back to their friends in Kentucky. My father, this being the day of joy to the Wabash Indians, we beg a little drop of your milk to let our warriors see that it came from your own breast. We were born and raised in the woods. We could never learn to make rum. God has made the white men masters of the world." Having finished his speech, Pyankashaw presented Mr. Dalton with 3 strings of blue and white wampum as the seal of peace. All must observe the strain of despondency which pervades this address, and it is melancholy to notice the imploring tones with which the chief asks for rum, the greatest curse which ever afflicted his people. The incessant petty warfare waged between vagrant bands of the whites and the Indians, with the outrages perpetrated on either side, created great exasperation. In the year 1784, there were many indications that the Indians were again about to combine in an attack upon the settlements. These stations were widely scattered, greatly exposed, and there were many of them. It was impossible for the pioneers to rally in sufficient strength to protect every position. The savages, emerging unexpectedly from the wilderness, could select their own point of attack and could thus cause a vast amount of loss and misery. For a long time, it had been unsafe for any individual or even small parties, unless very thoroughly armed, to wander beyond the protection of the forts. Under these circumstances, a convention was held of the leading men of Kentucky at the Danville station to decide what measures to adopt in view of the threatened invasion. It was quite certain that the movement of the savages would be so sudden and impetuous that the settlers would be compelled to rely mainly upon their own resources. The great state of Virginia, of which Kentucky was but a frontier portion, had become rich and powerful. But many weary leagues intervened, leading through forests and over craggy mountains between the plains of these distant counties and Richmond, the capital of Virginia. The convention at Danville discussed the question whether it were not safer for them to anticipate the Indians and immediately to send an army for the destruction of their towns and crops north of the Ohio. But here they were embarrassed by the consideration that they had no legal power to make this movement, and that the whole question, momentous as it was and demanding immediate action, must be referred to the state government, far away beyond the mountains. This involved long delay, and it could hardly be expected that the members of the general court in their peaceful homes would fully sympathize with the unprotected settlers in their exposure to the tomahawk and the scalping knife. Several conventions were held, and the question was earnestly discussed whether the interests of Kentucky did not require her separation from the government of Virginia and her organization as a self-governing state. The men who had boldly ventured to seek new homes so far beyond the limits of civilization were generally men of great force of character and of political foresight.